Good afternoon. I'm John Erdman from TEC University, and I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon session on coaching skills. If you haven't already done so, please open up your chat. We're going to be using it throughout this session. I'm going to ask some questions and I'll have you reply in chat. So if you would, go ahead and make sure you have that open. It's great to have you with us today. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about coaching. And really, we're going to talk about several things. First of all, we're going to start by talking a little bit about what's the difference between kind of the day-to-day supervision that most of us spend the majority of our time doing and coaching. We'll then look at a specific model of coaching that we think works very, very effectively. It's got 5 steps to it, and it's a great step-by-step process that I think works in a lot of situations. So we'll work our way through that model and look at that. Then we'll look at some questions that you can use. So as you go through that model, what are some of the questions that you might use as you go through that process of working through that GROW model? And then lastly, one of the things that we want to talk about are what are some of the skills you need to use as you ask questions. You want to make sure that the questions that you're asking are as effective as possible in terms of helping elicit information from the person that you're working with and that you're coaching. So that'll be the last thing we'll talk a little bit about, are those questioning skills. So let's get started by talking a little bit about the difference between supervision and coaching. In the chat, if you would, I'd like you to think just for a minute about what you think that difference is. And if you type that into chat, I'd appreciate that. So just kind of think about it. As you think about those two words, supervision versus coaching, what's the difference between those two in your mind as you think about those two concepts? Take just a moment and kind of throw those concepts out there, what you think are the difference between the two. So as we think about the difference between supervision and coaching, there's a couple things that we think make them different from one another. And so we'll kind of talk about those. So supervision for us is that short-term focus. It's kind of the thing that we spend probably as leaders, we spend 80-90% of our time on. It's those day-to-day task-oriented things that we're doing. It's telling folks, okay, here's what I need you to do. Here's how it needs to be done. Here's what the focus needs to be on today, giving people feedback on the tasks they're accomplishing. That's supervision. And as I said, that eats up most of our time as a leader. We spend most of our time in that sort of transactional mode where what I'm doing is I'm interacting with the folks that I'm leading, trying to get them to accomplish whatever mission it is that we're doing. And that's an important part of what we do, and it takes up most of our time. There is, however, a time and a place where occasionally we need to step back from that task-oriented focus and we need to think longer term. And that's really what we see coaching as, is it's a long-term focus, and instead of having those conversations about the here and now and what we need done, it's about having those conversations about where are we going in the future? What does the future look like for the airmen that you're working with, for the people that you're working with? That's really what coaching is. It's very much developmental oriented. It's an investment in that airman, in your organization, in the Air Force as a whole. And the real goal of coaching is that transformational experience. Instead of the transaction where I just need you to do something, here what I'm looking for is, how do I help you transform your capabilities, your skill, your future? And that's really what coaching's about. So very, very sort of different approaches. Many of the skills you use when you're a supervisor also apply to coaching, but there's some other things I think that you build on top of those basic supervision and leadership skills that make coaching different. So now that we've kind of looked at the difference, one of the things I want to do is kind of give you a definition of coaching that we use here at TEC University and kind of break this down, because I think it has some really key components that help us understand what this coaching idea is all about. So the definition of coaching that we use is partnering with people in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. Now, as I said, there's a couple of key components here. The first one, I think, is that partnership aspect. So much of what we do in supervision is kind of that one-way hierarchical communication. Coaching is sort of the opposite of that. Here, what we're looking for is a partnership. We're sharing ideas, we're sharing thoughts, we're working together rather than myself as the leader kind of directing and giving you guidance. Here what I'm trying to do is engage with you together to generate ideas, to generate thoughts. So it very much is a partnership process rather than a one-way process. So as you go into a coaching session, I think that's a really important thing to think about. I know as a leader, one of the things that I do, and I think most of us as leaders do, is the more experience we get in situations and we quickly come to conclusions about, well, here's what needs to be done, and we want to direct and we want to get things done because that's the nature of what we do most often. But in a coaching situation, we have to sort of back away from that a little bit and ask ourselves, okay, how can I back away and partner with the person that I'm coaching? How can I give them more of the ownership of this conversation and the ideas that we're generating? So it very much, we need to kind of shift gears to that partnership mentality. The second part of this definition that I think is important is, as it says, in a thought-provoking and creative process. We're going to give you a kind of a 5-step process for coaching, but I think a lot of times what ends up happening, at least in my experience of doing coaching, is it doesn't end up being this nice linear step-by-step process. It can go in all kinds of different directions. And I think an effective coaching session may end up going down a lot of rabbit holes that you go down for a while and you realize, okay, we've explored that idea, let's come back, let's go down another idea. So the whole idea in the coaching process is I want to get that airman that I'm working with to think, to begin to think outside the box and to begin to think broader and bigger than just what am I doing today? What am I doing right now in terms of the task and the job? And begin to think bigger picture. Who am I as a person? Who am I as an airman? Where am I going? What am I going to do in the future? So you very much want to think about that process in terms of how do I ask questions? How do I engage with that person in a way that creates some thought-provoking moments for them and is a creative process that you go in places that maybe you wouldn't in a day-to-day conversation. So we want to partner with those people in that creative process. Then I think the next thing that's really, really important is, as the definition says, that inspires them. So much of what we're doing in terms of leadership on a day-to-day basis when we're supervising people is about compliance. I need something done. I'm telling you this is what I need done. I expect you to do it. You do it. I give you feedback on how you did it. That's what supervision tends to be focused on. In the coaching side of things, what we're looking for is I want to inspire them. I want them to think about the possibilities, to get excited about where they're going in the future, what the future might hold for them. So it's about motivation, it's about excitement, it's about getting them to buy into the ideas that we're coming up with in that conversation. I want them to walk away from that coaching session saying, hey, this is where I want to go, and I'm excited about that future, and I'm excited about the strategy that we've come up with to get me there. Now let me go out and do that. And that's a key part of this coaching process. A lot of times folks, when they do coaching, they focus a lot on, okay, here's what your goals are, here's the path. But people walk away and they don't have that motivation. And all of us know we can all generate goals, whether it's losing weight or getting fit or all those kinds of things. We can generate goals and we can come up with plans of here's what we want to do, but we've got to have the motivation to follow through. So part of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing a coaching session is I'm thinking about how do I ask questions and get them thinking in ways that will help inspire them to want to take whatever we come up with and move it forward. Because if they're not going to move it forward, we haven't really accomplished a whole lot. So I want to spend time thinking about that. And lastly, in our definition, it talks about maximizing the personal and professional potential. And we think that's really important. This is, when we think about coaching, we don't think about, okay, how do I make you better at what you do on a day-to-day basis so tomorrow you do a better job? I'm concerned about that, but what I'm really interested in the coaching conversation is I'm interested in where are you going to be 6 months from now? Where are you going to be a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And so I'm thinking about how do I develop that potential so that 3 years from now, you are transformed and you are so much more effective than you were when we had that coaching conversation. The other thing about the coaching conversation is it's not just about that professional potential, but it also is an opportunity to talk to people about their personal goals. Where do they want to be? Do they want to get an education? Do they want to go back to school? Do they want to get a certification? And so coaching is a place where you can combine those two aspects and really think about sort of the whole airman, not just their performance, today during UTA and this particular task, but how do I help them grow as an airman, but also grow as a person? So that's kind of our definition of coaching. And those 4 elements I think are really important. That partnership, that thought-provoking nature, making sure that I'm inspiring and I'm motivating people, and that I'm finding ways to think about how do I think long-term about their potential and helping them to move forward. One of the things I want to do now that we've kind of listed that definition is I'd love for you to think a little bit about if that's what coaching is, where do you think you fit on a scale of, let's say, from 1 to 5, 1 being that's just not something I have any skills at, to 5, I'm an expert. Where do you think you are? And just take a moment and kind of think a little bit about where you think you fit on that scale. As I do these sessions, oftentimes, most of the people I run into kind of are in that 2, 3 range. I think a lot of us in leadership roles, we're really good at the supervision piece of what we do because, that's what got us where we are. But the coaching piece is just a little bit different and requires just a little bit different set of skills. So now that we've kind of defined what coaching is, what I'd like to do is move into the 5-step GROW coaching model that we recommend people use. And this is a model, you'll find very similar models in a variety of different places. We've adapted it in one place, and I'll kind of show you that. But what I've found is it works really, really effectively as you have conversations, coaching conversations with airmen, and you're thinking through, okay, how do I help this person move ahead? So this is the GROW coaching model that we recommend folks use. And the GROW stands for these 5 steps. So it starts with goals, then you talk about realities, obstacles, options, and the way forward. And we're going to kind of dive into each one of those and look at some things that you want to do in each one of those. I'll give you some questions that I think are effective when you get to each one of those spots and that you can use to ask questions as you move forward. So the coaching conversation really begins by focusing on goals. You want, like any journey, you want to start with, okay, where am I going? What's the direction? Where are we headed? And so the first thing you want to do in a coaching conversation as you sit down with somebody is you want to talk a little bit about goals. What is it that they want? Where do they want to go? And so the coaching conversation begins with that conversation, not necessarily like you were doing a review where you're talking about, well, here's where you were in the past, here's how you function, here's what your performance level was, let's see where we need to move forward. This is all about, hey, starting with where do you want to be? Somewhere down the road, where do you want to be? But whether it's 6 months, a year, 3 years, whatever that time frame may be. So these are some of the types of questions that you might want to use as you explore those goals. And once again, this is done in partnership with that person that you're coaching. So you might ask a question like, okay, in the perfect world, 3 years from now, what would have happened? Where would you be? What kinds of things would have happened for you? You want to open up the possibilities. You want to get people thinking big picture. At this point, we want to sort of minimize the thinking about constraints. And we really want to think about sort of in that perfect world, if everything went exactly the way you wanted it to be, 3 years, 5 years, 6 months, whatever time frame you want to talk about, where would you be? What would have happened in that time frame? And I think that's really important to let people just explore those ideas of, gosh, if I didn't have any constraints to deal with, if everything went exactly the way I wanted, here's where I think I would be. And that's gonna create that thought-provoking process, that creativity. So I would talk a little bit about that. Another great question as you work through this is, what will that get you? Sometimes people will just come up with a goal of, hey, this is what I'd like to do. In 3 years from now, I'd like to be here. I think it's a great follow-up question to ask. So what does that get you? Why is that important to you? What's important about that goal? How would that change your life in terms of at work and personally and professionally? What would that do for you? I think that's an important thing. Once again, remember, we're trying to not only come up with sort of a plan, but I'm also trying to inspire folks. And so I want to make sure that as we think about these goals, we're thinking about aspirational kinds of goals, not, hey, 3 years from now, I want to be promoted to this because I need more money. Well, that's okay, but that's not going to be the same as, a goal that's more aspirational. So I want to ask, so what will this get you? The next question is very similar. What's compelling about this goal? Why do you care about this? What is important about it? Same thing with the next question. How does accomplishing this goal help you? And I don't think there's anything wrong with also tying that into. So if you were to accomplish this goal, this is how you would be better as an airman, as a person. What would that do for our organization? What would that do for our mission? Help them see how having those aspirational goals and pursuing them not only benefits them, but benefits our organizations as a whole. So I think that's an important linkage as well. And then I like the last question, which is, what does success look like? It's one thing to say, they may have a goal that says, I want to be more assertive. Okay, that might be a great goal. But what does that look like? What does assertiveness mean? So in the future, if they're going to be more assertive, what behaviors would they be engaged in that they're not engaged in right now? So that would be kind of what you're looking for as you go through that question, is if you got to this goal and you achieved what you said you wanted to achieve, what is it going to look like? How is that going to look different than where we are today? So these are just some questions, and you can come up with other questions. If you go online, there's all kinds of places that will give you questions, but these are just some questions we found that are very, very effective. As you begin that conversation and you start talking about what are the goals that the person has. And so you're having this partnership, you're having this two-way communication about goals. Once you've explored goals, and none of these are like closed conversations, once you get done with them, you can't go back, because you may get to one of the other steps and realize, oh, we need to go back and readjust. But once you have a general sense of, here's what the goals are, then what you can do is you can move on to a conversation about the realities. So we've talked about where the person wants to be. Now let's talk about where are they now. What's happening right now in their world? And where are they at in terms of the things that they wanted, their aspirations, where are they at now? We're kind of trying to figure out what is that gap between where they are now and where they want to go. So again, we've put up here some questions that I think are really effective questions. You could come right out and ask the question. So how are things going right now? Where are you at right now? On a day-to-day basis, how are you doing on this? How do you feel about how this is going right now? What are some of the challenges you face on a day-to-day basis? And again, shaped in terms of what their goals are. So if their goal is fitness, I might ask them, so what are some of the challenges you face right now in terms of improving your fitness? What kinds of things are getting in the way? What kinds of struggles do you have? What kinds of limitations are there? So I want to ask those kinds of questions because I want to help that person understand where they are now, and I want to have them have a realistic picture. It's one thing to say, you know what, I want to be here, but they've got to also understand where they're starting from and make sure that they understand the realities, because as we start creating a plan to move from where we are now to where we want to be, we've got to be smart about addressing some of the challenges that might be in there. So I think it's really important for people to explore what are the realities. What's the biggest concern? How are things going now? So I talk about goals. We spend some conversation time about goals. Then we talk about reality. So now we have sort of the roadmap. Here's where you want to be. Here's where you are now. So we've sort of we've laid out the destination and we've laid out the starting point. Now what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about what's in the way. So between where you want to be and where you are now, what are some of the obstacles that are in your way? What are some of the things that are holding you back? Because if this is the goal you wanted, why aren't you there right now? Are there things that are getting in the way? And as people develop their plan of where they want to go, it needs to be realistic, and it needs to take into account those obstacles. If I say, hey, one of the things I want to do is I want to get a college education. I want to finish up my degree, but I'm a single parent of 3 children, and I'm working 2 jobs right now, and I'm doing all of these kinds of things. I need to understand that my plan has got to adapt to those obstacles, because there's going to be challenges in the way. And so I think it's really, really important to flesh out those obstacles as you have this coaching conversation. So here's some questions that we use in coaching conversations that we recommend people use. Just simple questions like, hey, so what barriers do you face? This is what you tell me you want to do. This is what you've told me, here's where you are. What are some of the barriers you face? What would need to be different if you were going to accomplish that goal? Think about where things are right now, what's happening right now. What would have to change to move you to where you want to be? What kinds of things would have to be different than what you're doing now? I also like the question, who is involved? Because typically what ends up happening is, as we think about these goals and as we think about moving from the realities of where we are now to the goals, it's not just about that airman that we're doing the coaching conversation with. It's about their supervision. It's about their family. There could be a variety of people who are involved or impacted by the things that they want to do. And so laying that all out and getting that out on the table, I think, sets them up for success as they begin to think about, how do I develop a plan to move towards the goals that I have in mind? So I think that's a really important question as you think about the obstacles, is who might be involved. I also really like asking the question, what resistance might you face and why? So think about who's going to be impacted, but also where am I going to run into resistance? If I can think that through ahead of time, that as I develop my course of action to move towards my goal, I can plan for that resistance. On the other hand, if I don't think about that ahead of time, then I'm moving along this path towards my goal, and all of a sudden I hit resistance. I'm not necessarily prepared for that, and it's harder to overcome. So I think it's a really good idea, as you have these conversations with people, to help them kind of think through, what resistance are they going to run into as they pursue that goal. Are there people out there who are going to say, no, I can't let you do this, or no, this isn't possible? Where's that resistance? Where's the pushback going to come from? And help them think through, after I ask this question, oftentimes somebody will say, well, this is what I'm going to run into, and I'll ask the question, so what are some strategies you could use to overcome that resistance? What are some things that you might consider in terms of that resistance? Is there a different way around this? Or do I need to have a conversation? So that's an important part of doing this. So we really want to spend some time kind of thinking about those obstacles between our goals and the current reality. Once we have those in mind, now we're ready to sort of start thinking about options. And in our the grow model that we're using here, you'll notice we have 2 O's in there. Oftentimes what will happen is you'll see grow models out there in the literature that just have 1 O, and they typically don't cover the obstacles. They have options. We really think that obstacle piece is really important, so we've added that in there because I think that's important. Only after you've really worked through and talked about those obstacles do I think you're ready to start looking at options. Because now I have a clear picture of, here's what I want to achieve. I've got a picture of where I am right now. And I also hopefully have a fairly solid understanding of, here's what's going to get in the way. Here's what I'm going to have to get over to make it to my goals. What are the things I'm going to have to overcome? So when we get to this options part, again, go back to what we talked about earlier, that it's thought-provoking, it's creative, get people to think creatively, and again, it's partnership. One of the things that's hard for a lot of folks to do, myself included, those of us who've been leaders for a long time, one of the people that we use a lot of their material, he talks about how all of us as experienced leaders, we have this thing called the advice monster. And so we listen to somebody say, well, here's my goal, and here's where I want to go, and here's where I am now, and here's my obstacles. And as they're talking, we're developing a plan. And we just want to come out and say, well, here's what you ought to do. Here's the 6 steps you should follow, and if you follow those steps, you will get to your goal. You've got to be really careful of that. What we're trying to do is we're trying to help that person develop a plan. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't provide advice and input, but be very, very careful that you're not trying to solve the problem for them. This is them creating a plan for themselves. Because again, that's where that inspiration, that buy-in is going to come from, is if they walk away from a coaching conversation saying, I created a plan to achieve my goal. They're going to have that commitment versus I came in, I had a goal, the person who did the coaching conversation with me came up with a plan for me, now I need to go out and I need to implement their plan instead of my plan. So here's some of the typical questions that we use in this option phase. What are some of the ways you could approach this? I also like, in an ideal world, what option would you choose? Again, getting that person thinking creatively and saying, if there weren't any constraints, in an ideal world, what would you do? Because if they come up with a plan that's, here's what I would do, then you could start talking about, okay, so are those constraints real? Or are there ways that we could overcome those constraints and still follow that path? So ask those questions. In an ideal, what option would you choose? What would you do if resources were not an issue? Because a lot of people, again, they will constrain their thinking, well, these are all the resources I have. I can't do any more than this. So I want to sort of push past that barrier, at least for now. I may have to come back and revisit that. But this is a brainstorming session. I want people to come up with lots of options, lots of ideas of, here's what I could do to get to where my goal is. I also really like the question, what would you do if you could start over? Sometimes that's a great question. Just say, so imagine we weren't in the situation we are in now. If you could have started over again from scratch, how would you have begun this, and what would the pathway look like? And then maybe there's some insights there into, here's the pathway that we could jump on and move forward. So we look at our options, and then lastly, once we've done that, now we're ready to sit down and talk about what's the way forward. So we have this clear sense of, here's my goal. I know where I am now. I know what the obstacles are. I've explored a lot of the options that I have. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with that person and have some conversation and partner with them to try and discover what's going to be the path forward. What do they want to do to get to where they need to be? And here are some of the coaching questions that we use kind of in that way forward point. What seems to be the best option? Obviously, that's a question you want to ask. So we've covered a lot of things. We talked about this option, this option. This is a place where you might be summarizing kind of the things that they've mentioned, and then just asking that question. So to you, what seems like the best option? Why? Why do you feel like this is the best option? What advantages does it have? What will it do for you that this other option won't do? So have them spend time really exploring those options and thinking about which one is the best. I like the second question you see up there. How committed are you to this plan? So if they say, hey, this is the option I want to pursue, you want to make sure that they've got some commitment to that. It's not going to be successful if they say, well, I guess this is what I'll do, but they're not excited about it. They're not motivated by it. So as they consider options, you may want to ask questions about. So will that option motivate you? Will you be energized with that particular option? If they're not, maybe we need to look at a different one. I also think it's a good idea before you make a decision about which option you're going to pursue to just kind of give some thought to. So where would you start on that? When would you start? How would you start? As you think about that in terms of the options, it may weed out some of the options, and it may point you to an option that this one seems like it might be the best of the options. The next question, what would you need, kind of does the same thing. I would take all of the options and I'd talk about them a little bit, and that would be one of my questions. If you were to proceed with option number 1, what would you need? What kinds of things would have to happen? If you did number 2, what kinds of things would you need, and how would you get those? And I also like that last question, how would you know if you're making progress? Again, what would success look like at the very end of that process? So that's the last question, or the last step in that GROW model. So we move from goals to realities to obstacles to options to the way forward. And typically you want to go in that flow. Now, how you do this, it could vary dramatically. It could be one conversation, but more often than not, this is not going to be a single conversation. It's probably going to be multiple conversations over time. In some ways, what I like doing is sitting down and saying, okay, next week we're going to come in and I want to talk a little bit about your goals. And we have a conversation about the goal piece. And then maybe at the end of that, we come to some conclusions about goals. And I say, so let's get back together at whenever. And let's talk a little bit about the realities of where we are now. And I want you in that interim time to be thinking about what are those realities, where are you at now in reference to that goal that you're thinking about. Again, you can bring them back in. Each one of these could be a separate session. You could combine a couple of those. What I urge you to do is spend quality time doing this. Don't think you can just walk in for an hour. We're going to have a quick conversation. They're going to walk away with this great plan that's going to move their life and their both personal and professional life forward. This is a process that takes time. It takes investment on your part, on their part. It takes a lot of thought. And so I think it's important that you think through sort of how you approach that in terms of timing. So this is the GROW model that we recommend. We think it works really, really well. As you go through this model, you're going to be spending most of your time asking questions. And so one of the things that we've looked at is what are some really good ways to ask questions as you go through this. The question I have up there, which step is most difficult for you? Again, this is something I want you to think about. I kind of already mentioned mine. When we get to options, I just want to jump in there and solve people's problems for us. And I think a lot of us as senior leaders and people who are experienced do that. But I think all of us may have places where we stumble a little bit. And if you can identify sort of which step is most difficult for you, I think that's helpful. So as you get into that coaching conversation, you can be aware of that and kind of pull yourself back and say, wait a minute, I need to listen to what they're doing. I need to put my thoughts and ideas aside for right now, and we need to make this a two-way conversation. So think about that question in terms of which one would be most difficult for you. And as you move forward and get ready to do some coaching, keep that in the back of your mind and think through some strategies in terms of how do I resist that temptation to jump right in, and if there's one of those that you do. So the next thing I want to talk about are some coaching questions. And these can be used at any phase in this process. These are some questions that came from an author. He's on the screen there. And I really like these questions. They do a great job of kind of getting things started and moving a conversation along. There's 4 questions I just want to talk about briefly. Kickstarter question, awe question, focus question, and a foundation question. The Kickstarter question is just, how do I get these conversations started? At any one of these levels, whether we're talking about goals, whether we're talking about realities. And one of the recommendations is just make sure that as you ask that question, you do just broad, open-ended questions that don't sort of narrow in on anything. And this is a great broad question. So what's on your mind? So last month we talked about obstacles. This month we're going to talk about reality. So what's on your mind? So I'm not limiting anything. I'm just opening things up. So use questions to kickstart that conversation that are broad, that are open-ended, and that get people talking. Then you could follow that up with another question, which I think is a great question, what we refer to as the awe question. And what else? And the and what else question is really an interesting question. One of the things I always think about is, why is this so important? And it's such a critical question, because what ends up happening is, oftentimes when you ask somebody, so what's on your mind? They'll tell you something, but it's not really at the heart or the core of what's going on. So I might ask an airman, so what's going on? Well, I didn't have a ride to work today. Okay, they didn't have a ride to work today. We might focus on that problem. But if I ask, and what else? It might be, well, I don't have a ride today because, and then I follow that up with, and what else? Well, that's because. So rarely will somebody just come right out and say, okay, here's the core issue that I'm dealing with. And so as we're doing this coaching conversation, one of the things that you want to do is, as people generate ideas and they give you thoughts, you might say, interesting, that's a great idea. And what else? And then you can do this what else question multiple times. So you can keep digging and trying to get deeper into what's happening in terms of those questions. The focus question is a question where what we're doing is we're trying now, once we've kind of explored some ideas, to focus in. So here the question is, what's the real challenge here for you? So they may have thrown out all kinds of ideas. I've got this, and this is going on, and that's going on. Now you want to start focusing in. So a great question at various places in the coaching conversation is that, what's the real challenge here for you? Another question I think is really good, this foundation question, is as you're trying to sum up, whether it's the goals, the realities, the options, is, so what do you want? So, and make sure you say it appropriately. That probably wasn't the perfect tone, but you want to ask the question, so what is it that you're after? So what's the end goal here? And so at some point you want to pull together their thinking and now begin to give it some sense of direction. And I think that's what that foundation question does, is it begins to say, okay, let's summarize our conversation. Let's summarize all these ideas that we've had. And now let's begin to focus them in and bring them to the foundation of what it is that we're trying to achieve here. So those are 4 questions that I think are really important and can be really, really useful in a coaching conversation. Now, as you ask those questions, there's a couple skills that we think are really important. As you ask these 4, the Kickstarter, the awe, the focus, and the foundation question. First of all, as you ask questions in a coaching conversation, make sure that you're asking one question at a time. All of us have been in those situations where somebody asks us a question. So what do you think about this situation? And based on what do you think are some of our options, and what might be the best option? And if that's the best option, what are the things that you think we could do to make that option a reality? Which question do I answer? So you want to make sure that you're not doing that. You want to ask one focused, very specific question at a time. If you have to write out the questions so you remember those questions and you're not trying to ask them all at the same time, do that. But focus on a single question at a time. Make sure that person is crystal clear about what you're trying to have a conversation about. One question, explore that question, dig into that question, go down all the rabbit holes that might be related to that question, and then as you come back out, summarize what you've talked about, and now throw out that next question. But do it one at a time. Don't do that serial question thing that you see so often people do. A second thing that I think is really important is be careful. I've seen coaching conversations and leadership situations where we as leaders will ask a question. It's more a rhetorical question. And oftentimes those rhetorical questions where we're not really asking for a response are more subtle ways of us sharing our opinions and our thoughts on the topic. And this isn't about our thoughts on the topic. This is about a partnership and sharing. So be careful of kind of rhetorical questions. I really like, when I think about a coaching conversation, I try and force myself to begin my sentences with what. When I start asking how and I start asking why, what I begin to do is I begin to narrow the conversation. When I ask what, it's a broader question. It tends to open the conversation up rather than narrowing in and closing down the conversation. So I want to use questions primarily to start with what. So what do you think about So I want to use that what question rather than the how or why or those types of questions. Another thing that's really, really important in the coaching conversation is we're trying to have this partnership conversation. You're going to have to be comfortable with silence. There's going to be a time and a place when you're going to ask a question and you're just going to get dead silence. And you can't be afraid of that silence. Hopefully we're asking thought-provoking, difficult questions, and those people that we're working with, they need time to answer that. But the natural tendency for people is to ask a question, the other person doesn't respond, and we want to jump in. So typically, if two people are having a conversation and there's silence, sooner or later somebody's going to crack. And if you know that's the strategy, you be the person that's quiet and wait that other person out. If you get to the point where clearly you don't think they're going to respond, then the strategy we always recommend is ask the question again. You could reframe it because maybe they didn't understand the question. So reframe the question, ask it again, and again, use that silence. But don't be afraid of the fact that they didn't respond immediately. Because if you're asking good questions, you're having a great conversation, these should be things that take them some time and effort to think about and formulate responses. And then lastly, as you go through this process, obviously use good listening skills. Make sure that you're paying attention to what the person's using. Your nonverbals are showing that you're listening, that you're summarizing the content occasionally. You're responding, yes, that's a good point. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, I understand that. So those kinds of responses. You want that person to feel like you are listening to what it is that they are saying. So those are some suggestions we have as you ask those questions for people. So we've really quickly kind of gone through this coaching model. We've talked first about kind of supervision and coaching. We talked about that grow coaching model, some questions that you can ask, the awe questions, some of those other questions, and lastly, some skills. Hopefully that gives you some core things that you can think about as you think about doing coaching. And once again, coaching is an important piece of what we do as a leader, but probably a neglected skill because so many of us get very, very task focused and we spend a lot of time. But in the long run, that investment is really going to pay off. It's going to pay off in terms of our airmen. It's going to pay off in terms of our organization. If you're interested in learning more about coaching, these are some of the resources that we use as we've developed the material that we talk about. And just as we think about teaching people how to coach, these are several of the resources that we think are kind of foundational resources that have some great ideas. If you're interested in learning more about coaching, we have an online course that's about coaching. You can go to our website and you can find out about in addition to coaching, we have a number of other courses. You can find those online. In addition, at TEC University, we are also available to work with your unit individually. If you want us to come out and do a session on coaching, we could do it online, but we also can work with you on developing coaching skills within your organization specifically for you. Once again, it's great to have you with us. I appreciate everybody being here today. Have a great day.
TEC University. Education your way.